Like, you know, if you were trying to work on a script and a character acted like how they want white women to act, you'd be like, this doesn't make any sense. This isn't how a person acts.
Lately, major figures in the MAGA movement have all become obsessed with one common enemy: white women. Fox News has declared that white women protesting in Minnesota are deranged wine moms. Right-wing pundits have been running nonstop segments and publishing news articles about cringe Karens like Renee Good. They've declared these white women protesting ICE as awfuls, aka affluent white female urban liberals, and they're public enemy number one in the MAGA world right now. But why is the right so obsessed with demonizing white women, a group that notoriously favors Republicans in every presidential election, a group that is increasingly trending away from them in a way that will make the party's electoral survival difficult without them in the future? Erin Ryan is the host of Crooked Media's Hysteria podcast. Today, she's joining me to break down how and why this war on white women started, what it's ultimately about, and why attacking white women specifically is so insidious and effective. Hi, Erin. Welcome to Power User.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, so to start off, I kind of want to zoom back and talk about where this hatred of white women kind of came from, or like when it started. I mean, you wrote this in your piece, but white women have actually been kind of a consistent pro-MAGA demographic. When did things change, and when did you start to see this kind of rhetoric emerge?
Well, I mean, hating women is a tale as old as time. I feel like there is a very strong strain of hating women in as much as they are not serving whatever purpose those people want us to serve or want women to serve. So, for example, in American history, white women needing protecting from some bad other has been the justification for all manner of state violence against Black and brown people, women and men, but primarily men. And so, you know, this is just a new iteration. White women are now out there visibly agitating against the structures that are supposed to benefit them, but actually are harmful to pretty much everybody who isn't a white man. And I think it's very like irksome for the people that need us to play a role, that we're not playing that role anymore. Now, when you said like white women are kind of a MAGA demographic, white women are a very large demographic in the United States at all, you know, as a whole. But if you take a look at different segments of white women, you'll find a lot of division. So like a white woman who went to college, for example, are much less likely to be MAGA than people with lower levels of education. White women under a certain age are much less likely to be MAGA. And so I think what we're seeing is women are refusing to play a role that they've been expected to play, and that has made people really mad. I think the white women as an insult thing, I kind of noticed it starting. I remember the Bo Burnham comedy special where he was like shut in. I liked the special. This is not me criticizing him, but his song "A White Woman's Instagram" in the comedy special, it was like a very funny way to poke fun at the way that a lot of women use Instagram, but you can't sing a straight woman's Instagram or a woman's Instagram. So putting white in front of women made that song feel like not mean-spirited, or it took away some of the awkwardness that putting it in a different way would have.
Yeah, no, that to me is the beginning of it. I think of 2020 as very much like an origin point of this. I mean, there was a lot of backlash around like the Women's March and like the sort of resistance type, like that era of Trump 1.0. I think women were villainized, liberal women were villainized by MAGA, obviously throughout that time. But to me in 2020, that's when you started to see it really hit harder. And I think that's because people started to get a lot more understanding, I guess, about like racial divisions. And there were all these conversations about systemic injustices. There's that tweet that was like super viral from the time of just like a leftist man putting white in front of like the most misogynistic statement about women, you know, that you've ever heard, and thinking it's okay because it's white. And I'm not saying that's what Bo Burnham was doing, but it did feel like that's sort of when I think a lot of people sort of really started to villainize a particular type of white woman. And I think the right recognized very quickly that like they could get a lot of left-leaning men specifically on board with misogyny by like villainizing white women sort of specifically.
Well, if you want to even take it back before 2020, you bringing that up reminded me a lot of like how people talked about white women after Hillary Clinton lost in 2016. And then even back in 2008, when Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama were running against each other in a pretty contentious Democratic primary, there was a sort of anger at women who supported Hillary Clinton for a variety of reasons. But I think the like prevailing assumption by people who didn't like Hillary Clinton supporters was that they were supporting her because they just wanted a woman. They just wanted to vote for a woman or somebody who reminded them of themselves. I don't want to paint with too broad of strokes here, because I'm not saying that people who didn't like Hillary Clinton in 2008 were misogynists at all. But there is misogyny that is like wrapped up and kind of hard to completely tease out of some of the ways that people criticized Hillary voters, especially right after 2016. And I think there was a lot of like hurt feelings that were legitimate too. Like, you know, the way that Bernie Sanders was treated in the 2016 Democratic primary, the way that it seemed like the fix was in, and how the more we learn about it, the more we're seeing just how unfair it was, and how there was like an organization basically behind promoting her at his expense. That's totally legitimate. But I also think some of the anger about that unfairness has been channeled into like a kind of disdain for white women. I also think like Lena Dunham, weirdly.
Yeah, I was going to say like the backlash to Lena Dunham and like the villainization of Lena Dunham. I think she represents a particular type of white woman. And a lot of these liberal women, like, I get it, like the resistance lib, like caricature and that sort of vibe of the 2010s. Like, I understand like Lena Dunham can be a ridiculous person. She's a celebrity, you know, but at the same time, that doesn't make the misogyny that is constantly levied against her okay. But it seemed to kind of like open the door for it, I felt like.
It feels like whenever there's a white woman who is acting like a white woman, whenever the door cracks to critique for her, legitimate critique goes in, and then misogyny like barrels through also. And that's kind of what we saw with her. Like, I remember in those days of the web, the critique of white women often came from leftist guys or people on the left, or like a sort of almost like pick me thing. I don't know, where it was like, I'm a cool white woman, so I'm picking on other white women because I'm cooler than them. And now it's really interesting to see it coming out of like conservatives.
One other thing that I think was interesting that I've been following and covering a lot too is just these very high profile harassment and abuse campaigns against women. Obviously Blake Lively most recently, but Amber Heard. And what you hear a lot in those campaigns, especially the Amber Heard campaign, which was this blueprint for, I think, so many misogynistic campaigns that have come after it, is like, well, she's just a rich white woman. This is a white woman, like no sympathy for white women, like da da da. And I think it's so insidious because there's a lot of people, I think, that understand like that white women are privileged. And that was sort of like the lesson that they learned from 2020 was like, oh, like white people are privileged, white women are bad. And we can say all of this horrible stuff and have no sympathy because this is a rich white woman. And it's like, yeah, she's a rich white woman that did a lot of bad stuff. Or, you know, Blake Lively is a rich white woman that got married on a plantation. That doesn't mean that the misogyny or that a misogynistic hate campaign is like acceptable.
Right. And it doesn't mean that misogyny is a major contributor to the volume of hate that they're getting.
I think what you wrote about that was so interesting in this piece, though, is now we're seeing those, which I guess were sort of more mainstream hate campaigns, hatred, misogyny. There's always been a sort of specific type of misogyny against white women specifically, especially white women that try to conform to society's like beauty standards are very like villainized. But now we're seeing the right, and specifically like these MAGA spaces, really go after white women and villainize like the wine moms. And I guess like Renee Good is the most recent example of this, where they just like very quickly kind of attacked her. What are your thoughts on kind of that emergence and that pivot? Why did MAGA suddenly get on board in such an aggressive way?
Well, I think that MAGA has always been a little bit about a specific vision of masculinity as like a dominating and destructive force. And the reason that it's sort of been able to get out ahead of the version of masculinity that we have on the left is because it's easier to just like write down in a few words, like being in charge, being like protector and the one that must be protected from. And like it's been harder for us to like articulate why on the left, why that is like something that is kind of like an anti-survival attitude for a species to have. And I think that something that we're seeing now is like when people are actually like, I'm actually not okay with this version of masculinity taking over and driving the entire world. I actually don't think it's good. And standing up and using what privilege they have because of their femininity and their whiteness, it feels like, I think to the domineering, hyper-masculine MAGA crowd, it feels like a betrayal. because they're offering like white women a fantasy of protection and elevated status. And I don't know if you know very much about like Phyllis Schlafly. She was the anti-feminist from the late 60s and 70s and into the 80s, who was basically the public face of the anti-equal rights amendment movement. And that was basically her entire line when she was like, we don't want the ERA. We don't want the ERA because women have protected status. We have a privileged status. And of course, she was only talking about like wealthy white housewives at the time. But it's something that we've seen kind of as a through line. And right now, we're at a point where the evidence of our eyes shows us that white women are actually not settling into that. I mean, some white women are totally comfortable with the idea of brown people and black people being brutalized for their benefit, but a lot of them are not. And I think that's coming up in a really interesting way. Something I found very interesting is that strategically, this feels like a loss of emotional control on the part of conservatives because they have worked so hard. I don't know if you read like conservative women's media, but I'm a subscriber to Evie magazine. The magazine that is
the like Peter Thiel, like
yes,
anti,
yeah. Well, I mean, they get really mad if you say that on their social media. Technically, Peter Thiel's fertility app, which weird that he has a fertility app. The fertility app was the biggest buyer of ads in the first like issues of the magazine, but it's also got the same name as the fertility app. But whatever, it's semantics. Evie is always like it's always hammering on this idea that like white women, you shouldn't have to apologize for being a white woman. It's not your fault, like what white women in the past did to other people, and now it's like after like trying to rally the troops, trying to like put out this whole magazine that's like white women, don't be afraid of being like skinny and straight and a mother and whatever. Now they're coming out and like they're unable to control themselves when those women are not behaving how they want. They're unable to hold themselves back and not be like, well, you're fucking like now they're just kind of coming out and it's like they can't control themselves. And it feels very like strategically not very smart for them.
One thing that I think is interesting, and you cited this piece in the Telegraph that I saw too, that was just ranting about, you know, angry young women and white women specifically, but they talk about toxic empathy. And, you know, like you mentioned, they've spent so many years conditioning people to mothers, you know, caretakers, you're the caretaker of, you know, the home, etc. But when then these liberal women sort of show empathy for brown people, it's like, oh, this is toxic. She's hysterical. Like her mind is not right. I just think they immediately like lean into stereotypes to kind of take away women's agency. And I think that like they do that to all women, not just white women. But I do think that there's this specific sort of caricature that they lean into of a hysterical white woman. They've done this to push like so many policies as well. They also constantly push this lie that the majority of white women are anxious and depressed. Jonathan Haidt, a reactionary guy, I'm not sure how familiar you are with him, but he's on the board of Barry Weiss's, fake university and everything. But he's written about, you know, like these neurotic young white women. Why are young liberal white women so neurotic and hysterical? The right also pushes the lie that everyone with long COVID is young white women. In fact, it's overwhelmingly black people and people of color because they don't have health care, obviously. But it seems like white women are this like convenient trope that they can kind of use to push whatever their policy agenda is. And with ICE, it's like, oh, these hysterical women are like out in the streets because they can't control their toxic empathy or whatever.
Yeah, the toxic empathy thing is so interesting to me because it's like we've completely lost the plot as like organisms living on the earth that are supposed to be a pro-social species. As human beings, we survive by being pro-social, which requires us to have empathy. And it requires us to look out for each other. It's like they want to design an inner life for white women, who I think that you're absolutely right. They can't wrap their heads around the fact that we have agency. And they want to design an inner life for us that completely comports with their worldview, which is actually like emotionally nonsensical. Like they want us to have their babies and eat them too. And it's like to tell us that we need to be maternal, nurturing mothers and like, oh, pro-life, you should care about other people's babies that haven't even been born yet. You should care about pregnancies that aren't yours because of the life that child could have. So they want us to have this like deep imagination and empathy for like these imaginary fetuses in people's private lives that we have no business knowing about. And then completely ignore our eyes and ears when it comes to watching a child crying as he's being, you know, picked up by ICE agents who are like gripping his Spider-Man backpack. It to me reads as like emotional illiteracy trying to overwrite what we are actually like programmed to be as pro-social human beings, which is people that look out for each other. I mean, like, talk about neuroses and anxiety. This is something that I realized when I was pregnant with my first daughter. I've got 2 little kids. During pregnancy, the brain changes, like your human brain changes. Your amygdala gets huge, so you notice things that are threats everywhere. But it's so that you can look out for your children. The sound of a baby crying just goes from being like just kind of an annoying background noise to like fingernails in your brain. Your brain changes to accommodate the fact that part of our job as like biological women who are reproductive is to like notice threats and look out for people that are smaller and weaker than we are. That's like something that is designed to help our species survive. So I think it's really interesting to read stuff that's like empathy is toxic, and it's like, then why is it something that happens to us naturally? Why is it like a natural state of being? It feels very like phony and false, and I think it comes from a deep lack of understanding of the humanity and agency of women.
Well, I think it's just like this very narrow definition of like who you are allowed to care about. Like women can be empathetic and caring to their own biological white children in the context of a nuclear family, but they certainly cannot care for like Black or brown people that are getting rounded up and deported. And if they do that, they're seen as like race traitors, basically. I mean, that's kind of how these women are treated. And I do think it like comes back to this idea of race, where it's like women that align themselves with like more multiculturalism or feminism, which is like a multicultural movement, like they're seen as like not part of the broader project, which is white nationalism. And so I feel like their kind of racial privilege or whatever is kind of like ignored, and men they just revert directly to misogyny.
Yeah, I mean, but let's not ignore the fact that the like white nationalist system, if it were like tomorrow, snap your fingers, here it is, we're living in a white nationalist system. White women who complied and obeyed, like under a system that subjugated them, would actually have a very high status in that system. And I think part of this is people on the MAGA side do not understand that some of these white women out there in Minneapolis, who are protesting alongside people of all demographics and races, by the way. It's not just white women. There's tons of white men. My family is from Minneapolis. Like, my dad did one of the marches recently, and it's just like videos he sent me. It was just like every type of person you can imagine is out there. But white women are getting a lot of heat. So I just wanted to like put that out there. I think that conservatives that are just puzzled by white women's activism can't wrap their heads around the idea that a person would see injustice and be like, you know what, it's okay if I lose a little bit of status relative to somebody else in order to right the injustice. Like, I'm not just out here for myself, I'm out here because this is unfair and this isn't how society should be treating anybody. And so if that knocks me down a peg, like, that's fine with me. And I think it just doesn't compute for a specific type of person.
Yeah, I also think it's just about keeping other conservative women in line and creating these like villainized caricatures of white women, of being like, oh, you know, what are you going to become? A wine, you know, this liberal wine mom, a childless cat lady, like a blue-haired liberal, like, you know, like all of these sort of tropes that we have for white women that step out of line, that do have solidarity with other people. Like, we know these caricatures, even like a Karen, right? Like, that is now used by the right against like liberal women. It's also just ensuring that those women who haven't yet, you know, expressed solidarity with other people don't, because they see the villainization and kind of like what happens, you know, when they do. Right.
And I think that's an important point too, that I don't think that these white women, I saw like a tweet by Eric Erickson that was like, Renee Good was an awful, and it's like affluent, white, female, urban, liberal, as like a slang. It's supposed to be like a slur against a white woman who's like protesting in Minneapolis, for example. But I think it's really funny that like, I'm seeing a real divide between what conservatives expect those women to care about and what they actually care about, because I can't think of anything that those protesters care about less than the opinion of a like chubby ginger who never ever would have their best interests in mind and would be willing to dehumanize them at the drop of a hat. And he's like far from the only one, but it was like just the most simple example of that trope being used in the wild. It's interesting to see the divide between conservative men thinking that women like that actually care, and those women actually not caring at all. And Taylor, you might be right that it's just designed to warn conservative women against stepping out of line. They're not trying in any way to like bring liberal women back to the fold or make some of these awful people learn their lesson and come running back to the kitchen.
I think it's also about like male grievance though, and also bonding through that male grievance and kind of like creating this thing that men can bond over, which is villainizing white women. And especially as the MAGA coalition becomes slightly more diverse in terms of men, like they have made inroads with Latino Latino men with black men. Like they have sort of gotten slightly more diverse. They're still not really diverse at all. It is a fundamentally like chauvinistic and misogynistic movement. And I think villainizing these privileged white women is also a way for more MAGA men to kind of like have this outlet and bond with each other and be like, yes, what an awful woman. Like, right, that's an awful lady. Like, she's so terrible.
I mean, we've got so many sports. Like, be normal and just team up against people who cheer for a sports team you don't like. I feel like that's a lot more healthy application of that sort of desire to find a tribe and to engage against another tribe. Just get really into sports, guys. They're there. There's so many of them. They're on TV all the time. You could do that instead of just like hating women overall. It just feels like a grievance against a system that they were told their entire lives was set up to benefit them. But it really was not set up to benefit them.
Which is also why I think they hate white women, because they think that they should be awarded white women. If they are MAGA enough, if they do the things, if they sort of adhere to these conservative values, they get this beautiful white woman who's just going to be a trad wife and never question them. And you see a lot more MAGA men rejecting white women and talking about how white women are bad and you need to be a passport bro. You need to go travel and find a non-white woman from a subservient country that hasn't been corrupted by feminist values. Even Pearl Davis has said that like feminism itself has made white women specifically like unmarriageable. And that's why men should marry these like Latino women or whatever, which would seem sort of counterintuitive again to this white like sort of nationalistic movement. But I think it's about control and subservience and villainizing, like being like these white women have lost control. Like we're going to take back that power by essentially going off and, basically trafficking some girl from an underprivileged country.
It does feel like they've been denied the participation trophy that they've been told their entire lives would be awarded to them. They want a life that their father had, that was easy for their father to have. And the reason that it was easy for their father to have is because their mother did not have the option to live on her own. And I think we're in a world right now where women, especially in America, who are privileged, middle class, educated, mostly white women, are able to look around and make a determination of whether or not involving a man in their life in a typical traditional heterosexual marriage actually is going to improve their life. And in a lot of cases, they're like, it's actually not. Men are not the prize. Marriage is not the prize. I'm married. I've got 2 kids. Like I said, you can be totally happy in a marital situation. But also, if I were married to some guy who like expected me to chase him around, work an entire job, come home, wait on him. No, terrible. What a terrible thing to expect. And I think a lot of women are like, we're talking to each other. We're seeing with our own eyes what our mothers' lives were like, what our aunts' lives were like, what our grandmothers' lives were like, and making a decision that in order for marriage to happen in our lives, the men that we invite into our lives must meet a certain minimum threshold. And a lot of the men, I think, that are angry, that have glommed onto MAGA are men that don't meet that threshold. They are not positive additions to the lives of women that they know. And there is like a way forward that would allow them to dispel some of the loneliness that they're maybe experiencing. And that is to become more active participants in the life of the family that they think they want and are being denied. That just means doing work that is in the past been very feminized. Helping a little bit more with childcare, being excited about splitting domestic duties 50-50, especially if you have a situation where you and your partner are both working outside of the home. Like, how are we splitting the tasks of being in a home together? And I think a lot of them are just refusing to in any way learn feminine skills.
But I think it goes back to like the reason white women are the target of that is because they think that white culture, like white feminist culture, would ask them to do the diapers or something. Whereas if they get somebody from maybe a more patriarchal culture or a culture where men are not expected to do those things in somewhere in South America or Asia or something, like they can opt out of that. And so again, it's just like, I feel like that like hatred of white women is really about like hatred of the progress that white women have been able to achieve through feminism in terms of this stuff. I don't know. So much of the white women villainization also just feels like it's just laying the groundwork for really bad policies. And it seems like if they can sort of push these narratives about white women they can roll out a lot of really regressive policies. Like, for instance, again, this idea that they're hysterical, shouldn't be trusted to make like policy decisions, easily brainwashed, like, selfishly refusing motherhood, AKA like we should regulate their bodies for them, destroying families through divorce. These people also hate divorced like white women. That is like, and this evil thing. And just this idea that they're like corrupted by education. You see this hatred directed at like young white women as well, where it's like, look at these crazy white girls, on campuses. Like, I mean, Ben Shapiro would villainize these people all the time, and Charlie Kirk, but it was like these silly women like getting these crazy ideas in their head.
Yeah, it is. It's interesting to see the pushback against like women's professional advancement. Like the Trump administration has recategorized some post-undergrad degrees, some like advanced degrees, in such a way that would make it very difficult for people to take out student loans enough to pay for those degrees. And most of the degrees that were recategorized are degrees that have a high percentage of women working in those degrees. So basically, like this little like paperwork switcheroo thing made it so that women who wanted to go to college who weren't independently wealthy enough to be able to afford out-of-pocket grad school would be denied the path to go to grad school because the amount of loans they could take would be very limited. We also saw in the Heritage Foundation put out a report recently that characterized women having degrees and focusing on their education. I think they called it like, I don't know if they said useless, but it was something akin to useless. It was like young women need to be encouraged to get married and start having children instead of pursuing useless prestige or something like that. The move right now on the American right is that they are really trying to intellectualize a push to get women to feel pressured or bullied into getting married and having children before they're 30. And so what we're seeing a lot in the like anti-white woman backlash is like, just picture the white woman that they're mad at. It's like I'm picturing like a Minneapolis protester. She's wearing a cocoon coat and she's got her mittens on and she's driving a minivan, and maybe she had kids when she was 35 or 36 years old, and like so she's not just this like young mom prancing around at an elementary school drop-off. They really want women, and specifically white women in a proto-fascist Christian nationalist society, to be kind of ushered into this like stay-at-home home life before they're old enough to realize that the life that they can have for themselves is bigger and more complicated than that if they want it to be. And it's very insidious. I think that the like white woman reactionary like stuff that we're seeing on the far right MAGA is the sort of like the id version of that, where it's not very strategic. It feels kind of sloppy. It feels like a bunch of people just got really mad.
It doesn't feel that way to me though. It doesn't feel sloppy at all, because it's like this is something that they have so consistently built towards for this entire movement. I mean, I just think of like even the earliest kind of iterations of this. And I think that like white women are so core and essential to the MAGA movement that I do think that they are very focused on kind of like keeping them in line through various ways. I'm not saying that like some of these men yelling about women online are like strategic in any way. I don't think that they're, but groups like the Heritage Foundation or some of these other people like pushing this stuff, like Chris Rufo or like these other right wingers, I do think that they think critically about this stuff. And I do think that especially the weird ways that like white women are being really exploited and attacked to push like these ideas. I don't know. I do think it's about enforcing racial solidarity at the end of the day. Like, I think that that's like kind of what this all is about, because the white women that they hate, it is women that support Black Lives Matter, in 2020, it is women that marry across like racial lines, which they view as traitors, or just any women that sort of shows solidarity. I mean, right now with ICE, right? It's showing solidarity primarily for non-white people. And so it just feels very much like, I don't know, like they want to define whiteness in these very narrow and authoritarian terms. And I think like when white women don't center their whiteness or they express solidarity with people who aren't white, like that is when they're being villainized the most.
Sure, but they're asking white women to be this set of mutually exclusive traits that they can't all be contained in one person. They're writing a bad character. Like, if you're trying to work on a script and a character acted like how they want white women to act, you'd be like, this doesn't make any sense. This isn't how a person acts.
Well, it's like being perfect at sex and having no body count, or like there's always these like contradictions, which I think also the red pill like body count thing is also insane and related to this. Like they talk about how like white women hit the wall or whatever, AKA like look older than 21 years old, like earlier than women of color. And that's why, like, you know, they're particularly, like, they need to get married even younger. That was an argument that I saw even recently.
Why do they care so much? That's the thing. Like, when I think about how white women care about men or talk about men, and maybe this is just my friends, but like, we're not like, they need to dress like this, or they need to act. It's just like, leave us alone. Leave us alone. Like, if a woman wants to get married to you and that's like her life's ambition, and she wants to have children, and she wants to do like the traditional nuclear family, and she's totally comfortable taking on the bulk of housework, and she wants you to go to work and be a paycheck and then come home, sit on an armchair, like, whatever, that is fine. Like, why do you care about all the people that don't want that? Like, there are people out there that want that. There are a lot of women out there who want that. I think that, like, the modern world is crazy and overwhelming, and a life with very defined roles, there are people that really think that would be appealing, right? So why do they care so much that not all of us want that? They can't marry every single white woman. You know what I mean? Like,
I know.
Why do they care?
But it's about subjugation and control, right? Like, I mean, this is why Pearl Davis, I believe, is still single. Like, it's like these type of women that buy into their system of patriarchy, like, they don't want that. They always want the ones that don't, because they want to be able to subjugate and control them. And also they sort of, I think, like, recognize that, like, men are not valuable creatures or whatever they're telling themselves, like, whatever that movement, like, I think that they know in their heart that's not true, and they don't respect women that do buy into that ideology because they know how flawed that they are. You know what I mean? And so I think that's part of it.
I think there's also something to be said about, like, you know, and I don't want to get too in the weeds here with the way the boys and girls are raised, but girls tend to be raised to do a better job forming social connections and building their own networks. And then when they become adults, if they're by themselves and they don't find somebody who's a suitable partner, they don't want to have a suitable partner, they can have a fulfilling life because their entire lives they have been doing that. You know, they watched their mother and they imitated their mother, or like they just were socialized that way at school. And I don't think there are a lot of boys that are, there are boys that are socialized to form groups and be good friends and members of their community. But like, if you go to a PTA meeting, like, who's running it? Like, it's the moms. Like, you bring your kid to school, the default is like they're going to call the mom if the kid's sick, even if the mom and dad both work full time. Like, there's like this default assumption. And I think that because of those things, the one upside of the fact that so much of this is put on girls is that girls can figure out how to have a family and a community without a man. And the reverse is not true. They need women, but women don't need them at this moment in history. Now, if we were in a much more violent society where men were like brigadiering houses and like knocking down doors with pitchforks, like it would be more necessary to have someone physically large and strong that was there to like keep their house safe. You know what I'm saying? But like, as it is right now, if you are a 22-year-old, graduated from college, you're like, you know what? I think I want to have a kid, but I don't want to get married, whatever. You can like freeze your eggs, unfreeze them when you're 32, get an artificial insemination, have a baby, live with some girlfriends. Like, you're probably all like, you could share that.
But that's what's so threatening, right? That's why they're so angry about it, is like, that is what is threatening.
Exactly. That's exactly what's threatening, is because I think they know that in order to have families, they need to have a woman who wants to have a family with them. And like, women have figured out a way to have something that is family-like, or a literal family, without necessarily having a man in their lives.
Definitely, which, yes, I think they're very angry about all of that.
It's crazy because it's like, I mean, I hate being like, not all men, but there seems to be such a divide among men too, where it's like they feel like almost different genders. To hang around a man who is like enlightened and smart and like fulfilled with himself and can form social relationships feels totally different than being around a dysfunctional, violent man.
Well, I think also, like, I just like back to what you were saying before of like just women having more options and stuff. Like, I think it's also important to point out too that white women are the ones that generally do have access to those privileges, do have access to IVF, do have access to, all of these issues. It's been interesting too to see the villainization of IVF and surrogacy, which is often framed against white women. Like, I've noticed so much conversation on Twitter lately. I have like a whole screenshot file of just like seemingly like progressive even accounts boosting like MAGA reactionaries on issues like IVF and surrogacy, where they're like, oh, these rich white women just think they can buy their babies. Like, why don't you adopt? You know, there's all these, which is crazy. That's not the same thing.
Also, the numbers aren't there to adopt.
No, and also like adoption is not the same thing as having your own child. It requires, you have to be prepared to adopt a baby, and that is something that you should be prepared to do. Like, that is a separate thing from going through IVF. Obviously, surrogacy and IVF are not exactly the same. And obviously, there can be very exploitative situations with surrogacy, of course. But at a time when more and more women are seeking reproductive freedom and seeking, you know, different family options and seeking, like, I mean, surrogacy has become much more normalized because of gay men and because, you know, so many people not just are struggling with infertility, but there's just a lot more families that don't look like traditional families where both partners can biologically have children. And these are things that, like, instead of having conversations of like, amazing, we want to have families however we can, let's make sure they're ethical. It's like they're trying to paint it as like these white women or like rich white women just want, you know, to buy their babies, or they won't have babies early enough, so they want to spend, you know, go through IVF when they're 45 because these, and I think, again, it's interesting how, like, fundamentally that's a discussion about reproductive justice, but the attacks are being filtered through these attacks on white women, which seem to be effective with, like, getting some people that are not MAGA on board because misogyny is so pervasive.
Well, I think that sort of backlash betrays a kind of lack of understanding of how sexist the idea of the fertility cliff was in the first place, and the way that women's reproductive and sexual health and fertility was painted as women's fault. And now the more, we barely even studied sperm. We barely even studied how, like, old sperm and low quality sperm impacts, like, reproductive outcomes. Like, we now know, after like the least possible amount of research, that sperm from like a really old guy that is not healthy sperm can lead to a woman having like preeclampsia, which is a deadly condition during pregnancy, and that miscarriages or repeated miscarriages are often due to low quality sperm, or that if a couple wants to get pregnant, a man should abstain from marijuana for at least 4 to 6 months before trying to get pregnant, and alcohol during the like attempts to like get. So there are like so many things. Like, for our entire lives, I was like hit over the head with this idea that, like, oh, she can't get pregnant, it's her fault. And also there was always a notion told to women that once you hit 35, it is like over. You can't have babies. Like, you're more likely to get hit by a truck than have a baby. And that, we're finding out, was based on like data from the 1700s from the countryside of France. Like, it is not something that actually holds, it doesn't hold out. Like, if you actually like try to figure out whether that's scientifically valid. And the sexism behind that was that women were brought up to think, okay, I need to do this, I need to do this, I don't have very much time. If I want to be a mother, I can only do it this way, and then I run out of time and that's it. And it introduced a level of like urgency to marriage and childbearing that artificially pushed women to make decisions before they actually had to. And so I think that anything that undermines that, so IVF, you can actually get pregnant and successfully carry a pregnancy well into your 40s now, provided you froze embryos and not your eggs. And surrogacy, actually, if for whatever reason, I have friends that had 2 children via surrogate. She had cancer and had to have her like reproductive organs taken out of her body. But before she had that happen, she froze all of her eggs, and they did IVF and froze the embryos, and they were able to have a surrogate. They were able to have 2 of their own children via surrogate. Like, that's an amazing advancement that they were able to take advantage of that. I think that anything that undermines the sexist framework that's like, if you can't have babies, it's your fault, you didn't do it soon enough, blah, 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 that threatens the structure itself. And that's another reason why I think they're angry. Although, again, Taylor, I don't think they're thinking about it this deeply. I think they're just reacting.
Well, I think most people on the internet are just reacting. But I do think that they think about these things. And I do think that there is some level of, I don't even think it's active coordination, but I do think that these narrative tropes take hold based on whether or not they're effective. And undeniably, villainizing white women has become effective for that movement because it's so pervasive. And because I do see these examples as well of like that rhetoric playing really well with a lot of, because it's misogyny, and because misogyny leveled against white women is viewed as acceptable by so many people, on the left or Democrat. Like, I do think that it has become very normalized. And I see a lot of like that hatred of like that villainization of women, like just play very well. I was fighting with somebody about it on Twitter the other day, and it like made me think of this guy that's like, I'm not MAGA, but these white women, and it's like, that is acceptable. And again, not to discount the many evil things that white women have done and do, but I hope that people kind of like recognize like what these attacks on white women are feeding into. And fundamentally, it is a very reactionary, horrible movement that doesn't just hate white women, but hates like all minorities and like all women generally. And like, I think white women are a very convenient target.
I will say that, like, let's not pretend that there aren't things that white women do that are like kind of silly. But I saw a tweet the other day that I was like, this is actually a perfect encapsulation of something that's been bothering me about the discourse around like even like boomer liberals or like, you know, these people, you know, with sassy bumper stickers about Elon Musk on their Priuses or whatever, you know, this sort of kind of cringe core liberal. And the tweet was like, I'm paraphrasing here, it's like, eventually leftists are going to have to understand that politics means sometimes interacting with people who annoy you. And I think that that really gets to the core of something where it's like, you know what? You might find a group of like hashtag resistance libs to be annoying, but that in no way undermines like the moral rightness of what they're trying to do or what they're aiming for. And if your values align with the values of somebody who you're like, oh, this person's a little annoying, work with them. Be annoyed with them. But like, you have to work together. We're in a point in history where we can't really like pick our ideal team based on like how cool everyone is or how original all their jokes are or how fun, you know, it's, we have to work, we have to play with the team that's on the field. And this is the team that's on the field. And so I think it's like, yeah, you know, fine, make fun of me, you know, in my like kid car that I drive, my like signs, I don't care. I think a lot of people need to kind of recalibrate and understand that like we have to work together with people whose hearts are in the right place, even though the pink hats might have aged poorly.
Yeah, 100%. No, I totally agree. Also just recognizing that like there's a lot of like complexities with every person and these tropes of like the wine mom or the whatever. Like, I mean, one woman that I think has done a great things for white women is that Jennifer Welch woman from the I've Had It podcast. I don't know, like I've just noticed that a lot more people are like, wait a minute, like maybe the wine moms are based. Cause like she'll say things like, I don't know, people deserve healthcare or like ICE is evil, or she's just sort of like outspoken. And it is nice to see people embrace someone that I think even 5 years ago would have been read as like a corny resistance person, but she's like, she has a moral compass on things like Israel too. So I don't know. I think just generally making people more aware of misogyny and like what these attacks are really about. Cause I think it might seem harmless to hate on cringe white women, present company included, but like, but it is really insidious and bad. I mean, I think so much of it is ultimately about just pushing this like evil agenda that we should all be against.
Yeah. And it's about trying to return us to a period of time in American history that never really existed outside of advertisements and that wasn't even making people happy back then. I said this on another podcast this week, but if they're going to try to like boot us back to the 1950s, they need to at least bring back Quaaludes.
And like single income household.
Right. There's a part of me that's like, actually, that would be kind of nice. That would be kind of nice if only me or my husband had to work, or we could both work part-time and I could be home 50% of the time and he could be home 50% of the time. Like, that would be nice. But the moment we're in right now does not lend itself well to that in any way.
Well, Erin, thank you so much for chatting with me today. I appreciate it so much.
Thanks for having me.
All right, that's it for the show. If you like my work, please support me on Patreon via the link below or buy a paid subscription to my tech and online culture newsletter at usermag.co. That's usermag.co. In my newsletter, I publish a bi-weekly roundup of everything that I'm seeing and reading online and paying attention to. You can also get my newsletter on my Patreon, again, linked below. On my Patreon, you can also get bonus episodes of Power User. I do monthly Q&As and more. I'll be back next week with a brand new episode of Power User. See you then.